Hi everyone! They say that flying is the safest form of travel, and if you take a look at the numbers, you have to agree, it really is. But things can still go wrong from time to time. Luckily, there are some very skilled pilots out there who have managed to avoid disasters and saved hundreds of lives through quick thinking and a whole lot of courage. You are going to be on the edge of your seat with this video. I'm Burke, and this is the top 10 greatest emergency plane landings ever. Starting off at number 10 now, we have the miracle on the Hudson. On January 15th, 2009, US Airways Flight 1549 took off from New York's LaGuardia Airport. 3 minutes later, it struck a flock of Canada geese and lost all engine power. The pilot quickly calculated that returning to the airport was no longer an option. They needed to land right now. He made the decision to land on the Hudson River. Now this was an extremely risky move. If they came in at slightly the wrong angle or speed, the whole plane could break apart. To make things even worse, it was the middle of January and temperatures were below freezing on the river. Against the odds, the pilot successfully glided the plane down. All 155 people aboard were rescued by nearby boats, and there were very few serious injuries. The flight crew were showered with awards and praise. The event was even made into a movie starring Tom Hanks as pilot Chelsea B. Sullenberger. Alright, coming in at number 9 now, we have the missile attack. On November 22nd, 2003, a DHL Airbus cargo plane took off from Iraq's capital of Baghdad. Shortly after, it was struck on the tip of its left wing by a missile fired by terrorists on the ground. It penetrated the fuel tank, which burned away most of the wing. The pilots desperately tried to stabilize the plane, but it had already lost control and they had to attempt a landing back at the airport. The aircraft was crippled, on fire, and approaching the runway far too fast. To make things even worse, a jolt of turbulence caused them to miss the middle of the runway and veer off into the sand when they landed. It took them over 3,000 feet, but eventually they came to a complete stop. The 3 people on board survived with no injuries, and the pilots were presented with honorary awards. At the number 8 spot now, we have the door. On June 12, 1972, American Airlines Flight 96 was on its way from Detroit to Buffalo when its rear cargo door just blew off. This happened almost 12,000 feet in the air, and so there was rapid decompression. This damaged the plane's hydraulic controls. The crew declared an emergency and turned back towards Detroit. The windows began to steam up on the plane as the decompression crept up to the passenger cabin. The oxygen masks failed to deploy, so the stewards had to go around with an oxygen bottle. Despite all of this, they safely landed in Detroit after a very rough landing. The only victim of the event was actually a dead person. Their coffin was being transported in the cargo hold and fell to the ground during the flight. Next up at number 7, we have the Volcano. On June 24th, 1982, British Airways Flight 9 was flying from the UK to New Zealand. When they were above the Indian Ocean, the crew started to notice something clogging up the windscreen. They switched the plane to de-ice mode and told the passengers to buckle up, even though their radar showed clear skies ahead. When the cabin started to fill with smoke, they knew something was seriously wrong. They had been flying through a cloud of volcanic ash from a nearby volcano that had not shown on the radar. Soon after, all 4 engines completely cut out. The plane began gliding down and calling for help to nearby airports. Some passengers feared for their lives and they wrote notes for their loved ones. Amazingly, they managed to land safely in Jakarta using only their onboard instruments, as the ash cloud had made it impossible to see outside. All 263 people on board survived. Next up at number 6 now, we have United Airlines Flight 232. This plane was flying from Denver to Chicago on July 19th, 1989, when one of the engines completely failed due to a crack on the fan disc, leading to the loss of all flight controls. The crew were now forced to use the 2 remaining engines and slowly bring the plane down to a lower altitude and hopefully towards a runway. They were low, which was good, but going far too fast. They slammed down onto the runway and the aircraft instantly broke apart. It then rolled over and caught fire. Tragically, 111 people died in this event. However, 185 people did survive, thanks in part to the skill of the pilots and the speed of the emergency services. If there is any silver line to this story, it's that it taught aircraft designers important lessons on how to avoid this problem ever happening again. Moving on to number 5 now, we have the Gimli Glider. On July 23rd, 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 ran out of fuel at 41,000 feet in the air on its way from Montreal Nashville to Edmonton. The ground crew had fueled the plane using pounds instead of kilograms. This meant they actually had less than half the amount of intended fuel in their tank. When the first engine went out, they prepared for an emergency landing. As they descended towards Winnipeg, the second engine went out at 35,000 feet. Their electronic flight instrument went dead. Everything went black except for a few basic battery-powered flight instruments. To make matters even worse, the pilots had never been trained to land with both engines out, and their flight manual didn't even tell them either. They diverted to what they thought was a small, disused airport, but on that day, there was actually a car show going on. The plane came in too fast and smashed its nose into the runway. This managed to slow it down enough to avoid the crowds, which was a good thing because many of them actually had no idea the plane was even approaching due to the fact that its engines were dead, so it was completely silent. Alright, next up at number 4 now, we have Pan Am Flight 6. On October 16, 1956, Pan Am Flight 6 was on its way from Honolulu, Hawaii to San Francisco. After climbing to 21,000 feet, one of their engines began to overspeed. The pilot slowed the plane down and cut the oil to that engine in order to try and stop it. This worked, but the propeller still kept spinning. They knew they were in trouble. They calculated that the drag from the propeller would cause so much excess fuel consumption that they would not have enough fuel to reach San Francisco. They had to land in the ocean. The pilot waited until daytime to get the best visibility and then started the landing descent. Just before landing, the wing clipped a wave and spun out of control. The whole tail end of the plane broke off, but the pilot had already ordered it to be evacuated, so all 31 passengers survived and were rescued by the Coast Guard. Next up at number 3 now, we have the Navajo Save. In June 1993, air taxi pilot Edward Wire was flying a small Piper Navajo plane across England with 7 passengers on board. About 40 miles from their destination, there was a huge bang and both engines went quiet. The right engine had fallen off. The exposed blade then ripped through the other engine. The plane started spinning wildly, and although Wyatt managed to recover it, it would happen again unless he maintained a steep descent that would make for a very dangerous landing. Below him, he spotted an open field and went for it. He dodged power lines while operating the controls meant for 2 people because the co-pilot seat was being occupied by a passenger. There was no co-pilot. Amazingly, the plane glided down into the field gently, and the only injury was a single person with whiplash. Next up at number 2 now, we have China Airlines Flight 006. This was a non-stop flight on its way from Taipei to LA on February 19, 1985. 10 hours into the flight, one of the engines failed. An engine that had given them problems before, but they thought had been fixed. The plane started to slow down and spin to the right as it dropped. Because of the clouds, the pilots became spatially disorientated and they had no idea which way up they were. They spiraled for 30,000 feet downwards, and when they broke through the clouds, the pilot finally leveled out the plane. Those on board had experienced almost 5 Gs of force. They continued on with their journey and landed safely in San Francisco. Thankfully, none of the crew or the 251 passengers were injured. And finally now, at number 1, we have Aloha. On April 28, 1988, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 was flying between Hilo and Honolulu in Hawaii. When the plane reached 24,000 feet, a small section of the left side of the roof was ruptured. There was a loud whooshing noise. The pilot felt the aircraft start to roll from side to side. When they got it under control, they looked back to see the entire cockpit door was just gone. They saw blue sky where the first class ceiling had been just moments before. The explosion had ripped the entire roof off. All of the passengers were buckled into their seats, but one flight attendant was thrown out of the plane because she was standing up. The pilot managed to safely divert and land the plane soon after, with half of the roof simply missing. I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been for the passengers, but good job to the pilots. Well guys, some of these were sad. Not everyone survived these emergency plane landings, but I want you to remember the reason these are noteworthy stories are because they happen so rarely. And also, there are some very skilled pilots out there that we should all be very thankful for. What video do you want to see on the channel next? I'm Danny Burke, thanks for watching as always, and I will see you all in the next one.